So you're all very welcome to today's International Transport Forum Ask the Author session on the freight space race about curbing the impact of freight deliveries in cities. We're waiting for just a few more people to enter the room. The format of this session is a 10-minute presentation to show you the key findings and methodology of the report, followed by the most important bit, your questions. So from now, you can put your questions into the Q&A function on your Zoom window, and once the presentation is over, we'll be able to moderate those questions. So my name is Ronan Mackerlane. I'm from the International Transport Forum's communication team, and I'm joined today by Joshua Paternina Blanco, Philippe Christ, and Luis Martinez. So these are the report authors, and if you haven't already, if you're not already one of the over 800 people who have read the report or downloaded the report, the link is already in the chat for you to access the report, and we'll take your questions after this 10-minute presentation. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor over to Joshua, who will present the report's findings. Over to you, Joshua.
Thank you very much, Ronan, and thank you very much to everyone who has joined us in this session. Now, to start with, I'm going to talk to you a lot about space. But when I refer to space, I'm not talking about the astronaut or the rocket science related space. Rather, I'm going to talk about a space race which happens every day in our cities and affects our livelihoods every day, but which gets much less attention and resources than the one taking place over our heads. The space consideration and the transport impact in terms of space has been the focus of 3 ITF CPB reports already. And of course, I'm going to focus on the freight space race one. To do this, I'm going to run you over some of the main questions that led our thinking for the report. First, what is it that we actually mean by the urban freight space race? Why is it that this race is important? How is it that different stakeholders participate on it? And finally, how is it that we can all, as opposed to just a few, win in this quite complex and challenging race? When it comes to trying to understand the urban freight space race, it's essential to think about the fact that in cities, we have goods going in, such as construction, office supplies, or e-commerce parcels, as well as goods going out, waste, recycling, returns. And of course, we also have goods circulating across the city. Now, all of these movements generate transport activity, which at the same time take up some space. This is better seen through the image that I'm sharing on screen. What is it that we can see? We can see a very reduced amount of space where different stakeholders all try to use it to the best of their capacity to meet their objectives. Here we have stakeholders such as freight receivers, the businesses, we have freight carriers, the van or the truck bringing the goods to them, but we also have pedestrians, maybe going to buy some groceries, as well as cyclists. And underlying to all of these is the invisible but present role of public authorities. This is exactly what we mean by the urban space freight race. As different stakeholders try to simultaneously use a space, they embark on a race to understand, harness, and manage urban street space for improving deliveries, urban function, and citizen well-being. But then why is it that this race is so important? Well, first, it's because of something that I just mentioned, and it's the fact that urban street space is a very scarce resource. And because of this, the way in which we use that scarce resource affects how livable cities are. We know that if many stakeholders try to use the same patch of space at the same time, it can lead to congestion, thereby increasing emissions, greenhouse gas and local pollutants, creating noise pollution, generating time and economic losses, and even potential road safety concerns for all stakeholders. But if this was not enough of a motivation to focus on this race and on the street space use of freight activities, maybe we should also look at some of the disruptive trends in urban logistics, which are also having space-related impacts, such as e-commerce, the COVID-19 pandemic, new urban logistics facilities in city centers, as well as new distribution patterns, new data sources, and urban freight-related innovations. All of these happening in a context where, at the same time, we have passenger mobility going on. So because of this, it's relevant to focus on this race. And yet, how is it that different stakeholders participate on this complex situation? A considerable amount of work on this report went to trying to understand what were some of the main action levers that different stakeholders could act on to have an influence on the space use of logistic activities. And so many stakeholders, for improving their freight activities, can try to have an impact on where, when is it that deliveries take place, but also the vehicles that are used for them and the intensity of freight flows, how much deliveries actually happen. We identified and qualitatively explored the potential of 21 urban logistics related measures that can be implemented by all sorts of stakeholders, many times simultaneously, but not all the time with positive results because done in a discoordinated manner. Some measures affecting the where include the development of sustainable urban logistics plans, as well as urban vehicle access regulations from local authorities to the development of logistics facilities by private actors. On when, some measures included off-peak deliveries or even the development of parcel pickup and drop-off points. For facilitating the vehicles change, of course, private stakeholders promote fleet change measures, which can also be furthered with public intervention, for instance, by promotion of cargo bikes. And then, when it comes to the how much, authorities can also participate in the consolidation of freight actions, for instance, by promoting stakeholder cooperation, or even freight and passenger flows integration. Now, we saw that different stakeholders participate on this race through different levers, but how is it that we can all win on this race as opposed to just a few? The first answer is that we need to better understand the race. And for this, it is important to measure space. Now, space needs to be measured both dynamically, the space that takes a vehicle while it moves, as well as statically, the space that is occupied by a vehicle as it stands idle. And of course, it's important to measure it as well across time, because as we saw, the time, the space use of freight and passenger vehicles changes across time. Because of these, we at the ITF developed an integrated urban passenger and logistics model, allowing to measure the space use, road safety, and emissions consequences of different policy measures. This by taking into account both urban passenger and logistics components and flows. But once we are able to measure space, a second important element is to give authorities capacities and resources to manage, regulate, and coordinate actions. Now, most often than not, today, freight logistics and their space consequences are a matter of private action, much less of public one. But then to try to test the hypothesis of the impact of giving authorities more capacities and their potential benefits, we developed four main policy packages, including many of the measures that I highlighted before, and assigning them to the main actor which would implement them. We have a policy package of doing nothing, one where private actions are voluntary based, one where public management takes the voluntary-led private actions to try to improve its positive impacts and decrease its negative externalities, and a combined ambition where on top of public management, authorities also cooperate with many different stakeholders such as freight, receivers, and carriers to improve positive impacts. And now, just to understand how is it that this combined ambition with public intervention and coordination is better than just a private action-led situation, we try to include in this situation the impact of urban vehicle access regulation, affecting both in and off streets circulation, leading to higher mode shift to medium trucks and cargo bikes. This also allowed having higher load factors and having a safer coexistence of modes. And just so that you can have an idea of the potential impacts of such an approach, a combined ambition would have 3 times more reduction of unnecessary logistics trips than a private action oriented perspective. The street space consumption would be even 50% higher than just with private action alone. And the risk of crash between bicycles and freight vehicles would also be even 50% higher. Beyond this important public presence, we also try to estimate the better data, the implementation of better data to manage curb space dynamically for passengers and freight alike. And so in a combined ambition star plus scenario, we included the impact of having authorities promote dynamic road optimization and in combination with shared mobility. Now, these further the logistics street space consumption use found in combined ambition by around 30%, same as the risk of crash between bicycles and freight vehicles. Just to wrap up very briefly, what we found in this report and what we recommend leads to giving authorities a key role to manage all freight movements in metropolitan areas, and especially to manage curb space with a focus on the needs of both passenger and goods transport. We also recommend to implement access regulations for delivery vehicles in urban areas while considering business practices so that this is done in coordination with all stakeholders. And finally, that authorities leverage adapted space indicator and logistics data to better monitor and manage freight flows. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take on your questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Joshua, for a very comprehensive look at what's indeed a very, very complex question. As you mentioned earlier, this report is one of a trilogy, so to speak, all run by the ITF's Corporate Partnership Board. You can see the links to the 2 other reports that you cited earlier in the chat right now. So don't hesitate from now to put your questions into the Q&A function, and we'll try to answer as many of your queries as possible. And to get the ball rolling, question, I think for Joshua, given the results of where public authorities take the lead in managing street space, why is it that this doesn't happen more in a more widespread way across the world? Why is it that public authorities are not taking the lead in freight activities, even though they're happening in public spaces?
Thank you, Ronan, for your question. The key question behind, I think, our results. Now, what's interesting to see is that freight activities, as long as there have been cities, have been at the center of public preoccupation. But the approach that public authorities have given to freight elements hasn't always been the same. As my colleague here present, Philip Christ, likes to remind us, in Roman times, freight regulations in cities was one of the crucial elements of public action at the time. Nowadays, it has been decided that private stakeholders, private carriers, need to take the lead in promoting urban logistics. But we've seen that this privately led approach with low public intervention is reaching a limit, because especially of the different trends that I mentioned. Increases in e-commerce have highlighted the fact that it's very, very can be counterproductive to only let private actors try to manage freight activities to the improvement of livabilities of cities. So this is why we insist on exactly this point, on the important role of coming back to the important role of public authorities to manage not only the space consequences, but overall the freight activities that take place in cities.
Okay, I see. Thank you for that. We have a question in from Maximilian Schauchner, who's asking if we have examples worldwide of cities serving as best practiced examples. Do we have a ranking of cities where this is happening better than in other cities?
Here I would let my colleagues also complement my answer. We do not generate such a ranking. We haven't done such an exploration. What's interesting to see is that the 21 measures that we explored were present throughout the whole world. There were some cities which were implementing effective urban vehicle access regulations. There were others who were promoting pickups and drop-off points found across the whole world. And we tried to integrate in our scenarios a combination of all of these best practices. Now, of course, the policy recommendations that end up serving one place is going to be different from another. We don't necessarily see as an objective that everywhere in the world applies the same policy recommendations, but rather that authorities take the leading role and in there try to see among the wide policy options that they have, which are the ones that fit their capacities, which are the ones that fit their resources, and that they engage further into this question.
I can add a few things to that, to say that there are cities that we can identify that for a number of different reasons have put in place a more comprehensive approach to try to manage urban freight distribution and urban logistics. And these tend to be those that have been faced with sudden decreases in available capacity or planned decreases in available capacity. A classic example is London facing the Olympics, knew that they had to release some street space for the transport of officials and athletes, and that they would not be able to function as they had before. And they used this as an opportunity to convey, or to convene rather, a cross business and government board to help replan, retime, and reconfigure the logistics processes in the cities. And two things that have happened since then is that that convening mechanism has stayed in place, and the policies that they put in place also have gone on after the Olympics. The one last thing I'd like to point out is that, again, we have picked up on a number of different activities or levers that have been activated across the world, but there's also a framework for thinking about how to activate these levers in the urban sustainable urban logistics plan, or sustainable urban freight plan, which is in addition to the sustainable urban mobility plan process and protocol that has been developed in Europe, but is used around the world. And so for SULPs, sustainable urban logistic plans, there's also a formal mechanism whereby actors can come together, identify and characterize the urban logistics ecosystem, and then start thinking together about how they can manage that in a way that ensures that societal outcomes are maximized.
Thanks indeed, Philippe. Sten Vandal is interested in the space not only above the street, but below the street, and is wondering, have we considered in this work the space that's actually underground, given systems like pneumatic garbage collection and capsule pipelines could possibly take away up to 30% of car and truck transport in streets that might be specific to refuse collection. Do we have any opinions on that?
Thank you for the question.
Go ahead, Joshua.
Thank you. No, I was just going to say that this is these are measures that actually came up at some point during the debates linked to our work or the discussions, but they were not reflected into the report itself, and so we haven't measured their potential impact. But it's definitely a sort of measure that I think would be relevant to explore in the future. And this just leads me to an important point, which is right now we have many innovations, and it's important to try to run pilots to see their viability, but also their potential impact. And this is, of course, part of a very wider ongoing work.
I would just add that we can see in some cities the use of non-visible infrastructure underground or hidden infrastructure as one of the ways to move some of these materials. The city of Copenhagen, or many rather buildings in the city of Copenhagen, actually have waste chutes that connect to centralized waste collection bins that are then serviced by a vehicle. And that's important because it also reduces the amount of time that the vehicle is actually stopped on the street gathering the waste from the different buildings. So there are these type of hybrid systems where part of the system can be as raised pipe-based or otherwise not taking place on public infrastructure, but that also has an impact on the efficiency of the overall logistics system. Water access to cities, some cities are using that, especially for bulk goods, construction materials, which are by tonnage the most important construction materials, and waste by bulk, by weight, the most important flows in many of our cities. Cities that do have water access, Paris is included, can help organize these flows by barge. And finally, shout out to Ian Wainwright, who actually helped manage the London Olympic and Paralympic Road Freight Management program that I spoke of. He's in on this call, so if you are looking for more information, feel free to contact him afterwards, Ian Wainwright.
And that segues very nicely into our next question from Ian Wainwright, who is discussing the private-public issue, and that makes the valid point that freight is, of course, a commercial activity, and that access restrictions, or should we say access regulation, needs to be very carefully planned to avoid actually increasing the number of vehicles, and that the better data that we describe needing to achieve that is very often privately held data. So how do we work through these suggested access restrictions? What sort of a paradigm do we put in? Is it by time, vehicle size, routes, etc.? And how do we obtain the data, which is often in private hands?
If I can start on that question, thank you so much for it. The viability of vehicle access regulations is crucial, and from my opinion will depend on case-by-case situations. I think that what's important is to try to understand why is it that a regulation of vehicle access regulation wants to be implemented. Is it because authorities want to promote vehicle fleet change? And if so, in this, it would be essential to try to understand what is it that are the capacities of of private freight carriers to actually promote this shift the moment that regulations are in there. And this applies for different vehicle characteristics. And I mean, you know this better than I do. When done right, it can have very positive externalities, as we've seen in London. When it comes to the time question, what we discuss in the report is that there needs to be attention to why is it that authorities would implement vehicle restrictions to shift delivery times. And this is because implementing a regulation or a vehicle restriction can have an impact on the freight carrier, but doesn't always have an impact on the freight receiver, who still expects deliveries to be done at a certain time and is not as likely to change behaviors if targeted measures do not directly speak out to freight receivers themselves. So because of this, I would say that first, the question needs to be there on why is it that a restriction is wanted? And second, once the question is identified, or the main motive, is it if the restriction itself is going to be the answer, and who are the stakeholders that would otherwise need to be engaged so that the restriction is applied.
And if I can
successful.
If I can just add to that, I think it's really important, as Joshua is pointing out, that what we're really talking about here are vehicle access regulations to better manage the reallocation or the allocation and the use of what is oftentimes a contested space, street space. Restrictions may be part of the answer, but they're not the only answer, and they're not necessarily a universal answer. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. The second, but more question and more to the point, Ian, of your point about data, why would or how do you motivate the private sector to share data? Well, I think one of the things that is clear in any kind of data sharing relationship is those who benefit from providing data in a measurable and discernible way are typically more motivated to share that data. And so by providing data that allows public authorities to better identify blockages, roadblocks, and tensions that could be better addressed through policy, that would improve the performance of the private sector in delivering parcels or getting construction waste in and out of the city or delivering clean towels to hotels, whatever it is, then that is a benefit. And so that would be one way in which to motivate the kind of data sharing that would improve the management of freight and logistic flows in cities. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that in cities, more and more, many more vehicles are providing data. Instrumented vehicles will be providing data in the future, and it would be unusual and difficult to manage if you had passenger vehicles providing some level of data that allows the city to understand how passenger traffic is operating and not have analogous data from the freight side. And that, again, would be something that would be harmful in the end for those actors who are in this delivering or carrying out freight delivery or logistics support services. So that's the mega trend. And the more immediate answer is you give data with the expectation that you'll benefit from that data. And I think that's certainly something that public and private actors can work together on.
Yes, and just one very small thing that to add is one important element is to understand that we have a balance of between static and dynamic space that is consumed in cities, and which is for if you use the static space for you to park and to put out the deliveries, or it's the congestion, or that you want to manage the access restrictions because they are creating congestion on the dynamic element of larger vehicles and in peak periods. Then it's also important to understand what is the restriction, as Joshua mentioned, that you want to be sure that you want to balance out. Then it's the space of the static area, because especially this is important in some times of the day, where, for example, you may have a conflict with residents that they are parked, or it is an element of trying to manage the dynamic space, and then the conflict is a different one. Then there is not a universal answer, and one that is important also is to understand what are the restrictions of the type of commodity that we are serving. It's not the same if it's a climate control good, if it's a parcel, if it's garbage, etc. Then the type of good that you are that is give restrictions of access. I think it's a very important element for you also to introduce on the equation of the management, not just the vehicle.
Thanks indeed, Luis. I think we've answered a lot of a question from Ozan Yilmaz, who's asking about the actual motivation of private action by the private sector. We talked about data. Are there examples of where there is actually a business case for the private sector to factor in these externalities, which otherwise they wouldn't normally, these negative externalities of freight delivery? Do we have examples of a business case where that has actually been actioned?
I would answer first by saying that freight actors, especially freight carriers, they already have ingrained motivations to start doing some of the measures that we highlighted in our report, even without trying to look at emissions or space gains or even road safety gains. Some of the motivations can be linked to reducing delivery times, improving the deliveries in city centers, especially in very dense cities where delivering, for instance, by a cargo bike might be much faster than doing so with a larger vehicle. And this, of course, will affect the operational characteristics of their activities, but it is a trade-off that can already be there, or a question that can already be there, even without having public the public obligation behind or expectation, or even without trying to for corporate social responsibility objectives to integrate road safety or emission factors. Now, this leads me to the second point. It is that some carriers, especially larger ones, are also integrating these considerations, emissions reductions, as well as road safety gains within their corporate functions, either because of public expectations or because of other considerations. And many times, even if the shift, for instance, to smaller electric vehicles wouldn't be cost effective, if the cost loss is minimum, but it would improve corporate image of an enterprise, this can be a trade-off that a freight carrier could accept if it fits its wider corporate purpose. And this is something that was seen by authorities in cities such as Buenos Aires when trying to see why is it that some carriers would facilitate shift to electromobility and other type of vehicles, while others, much smaller, without corporate social responsibility programs, would have. So I think that it's relevant to think about what are the inner motivations that some enterprises would have according to their sizes for starting this change without needing to think about emissions or road safety. I mean, there is already a business case for this. Then, of course, as you mentioned in your question, further regulations from authorities or incentives could further this business case, but it's already there in many cases.
Just wanted to add one thing that is, I think, important to understand. There is a problem that we have nowadays because there is no parcel, for example, parcel consolidation strategy, even within the same company, but also across companies when you receive it. And also another thing that it's important, there is not a trade-off of person that orders parcel for the last mile delivery and their occupation of street space with parking. Then otherwise you are even creating a double consumption of space with your vehicle idle, and also you create a dynamic and static space of the delivery that you are requiring for it to be delivered at your home.
Thanks indeed all for those answers. We're up against our time. We've got time for just one more question from Sten Vandal. And Sten, please clarify if I haven't got this question right, but Sten is wondering if there's examples where city freight logistics have been coupled with passenger transport logistics in a scenario, I presume, where we're talking about using the same networks of passenger transport for freight, and refers to an example of a potential Amazon tax in Milan. So are there examples where freight is piggybacking on passenger transport?
Just very quickly, the Amazon tax is proposed in Barcelona, and that's for a certain level of in this case, parcel distributor. Certain business volume would have to pay a tax on their activities. I think there's two questions here. The first is, can we not leverage existing services and capabilities to deliver freight? Public transport and or other shared mobility modes? And that is a question that we looked at, and I'll let Luis and Joshua speak to that because that's more in their experience. But the second question is, can we just not do a better job in consolidating flows in and out of cities, with the example here given of parcel delivery? And there's some good justification for thinking that is a clear possibility. When we look at the optimization of flows within, for example, an Amazon or a DHL or a UPS picking facility, those are highly efficient. but that's one operator. And one of the things that Joshua has pointed out is that we're talking about not just a few hundred operators, but in some cases, thousands of operators that are all making decisions that are not optimized. And there's a long history in urban freight logistics of thinking, well, how do we better optimize those flows? And unfortunately, that history doesn't have many successes. Back in the 80s and 90s, there was already this idea of having these consolidation centers outside of cities, and in almost all cases, none of those have been successful. Potentially the kind of lessons that are being learned from floor management within these picking and distribution facilities, like the ones I mentioned, could be something that would have more success. And certainly the work that we did here suggests that it would, because we did model some of that. But it is not an easy solution. But maybe Luis and Joshua, more on this idea of combining freight delivery with other mobility services.
Yes, we tested the integration of parcel deliveries with the shared vehicles, especially with the shared taxis. When the vehicle is idle, he can be used for parcel delivery. He would pick the parcel in the back seat and back seat or in the truck and just be delivering it with when not a passenger available. This has had a limited availability because we had constraints on the characteristics of the parcel that would allow to do that. But it has a potential, especially when we see that during off-peak periods, the part of the time that these vehicles are idle is quite significant, and could also be an additional resource or revenue for them. Also important, if instead of going directly to the last mile element, if they can be delivered in a parcel locker, then can be even more efficient, because the driver could take already 10-15 parcels and send them together to the same locker instead of doing it door by door. Another element that is important to understand is that there is not currently a trade-off or a management of the choices, the commercial choices of companies on how to select the vehicle or the operator who provides the last mile services. I'll just give an example that there is an incentive of companies nowadays to divide the number of operators that give do the parcels, even for one customer, because they have like a reduction on. We cannot forget that companies, with what they want is to maximize their profit. Then they have an incentive to split among several providers to have a cheaper cost of each one on how much they are charged, because we don't pay as a customer. Sometimes they tell us that it is a free parcel delivery, but in reality this has a cost. Then if the company has an ability of putting this split, and then it ensures to a company 50 parcels per week, then you have a price. If you have 100, is another price. And if you split to have at least 100 to each one, you have a much cheaper price in all the companies. Then you have an incentive to split. Then there is like room there also for regulation to align the objective functions of each company with the public interest. But there is currently no alignment on that part.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to leave it at that. We've gone over our time because of the huge interest in the topic. Thank you very much, Joshua, Luis, and Philippe, and to everybody who participated in.
Oh, you're muted, Ronan.
Thank you very much, Philippe. I was just thanking you all for your great presentation, answers to the questions, and for all the participants and their questions. There are ways to stay in touch with ITF in the chat via our newsletters and our social media. So we look forward to seeing you.
If I can just add one thing, none of us will be able to explore space, but all of us will be able to explore the space race that we've talked about in these reports. So I hope you do that.
Eloquently ended. We look forward to seeing you at our next Ask the Author event. Take care.
Thank you very much.